Today we venture into a more difficult and often uncomfortable subject, pedophilia and sexual perversion, particularly within the context of religion. The goal is to explore how sexuality and its energies exist not only in humans, but in all living beings, and how religious suppression has profoundly influenced our societal understanding of these issues. Religion has often preached the suppression of these natural energies, portraying them as sinful or evil. However, when individuals are free from religious restrictions, they tend to recognize these energies within themselves. Despite outward condemnation, religious leaders themselves are not immune to these desires. Many, ironically, fall into the very temptations they preach against. Simultaneously, society struggles to educate young people on sexual health and responsible behavior, leaving them confused and vulnerable. Open discussions about sexuality, consent, and responsibility are largely absent, creating a culture of silence and fear. One tragic example demonstrates the consequences of this suppression. A young girl unaware of how to deal with her pregnancy due to the lack of sexual education hides her condition. This secrecy ultimately leads to a terrible outcome, one that could have been prevented with access to contraception or proper education. This raises a difficult question. Would it have been better for her and the child if there had been more open, responsible discussions on sexuality or access to abortion? Sexual energy is a natural part of human existence, even from a young age. However, society tends to ignore or suppress these urges, causing confusion, guilt, and shame. Adults, including parents and religious figures, often fail to address these issues adequately, leaving children unprepared and conflicted. Meanwhile, these very adults frequently indulge in the same desires they preach against. Fundamentalist leaders have gone so far as to claim that AIDS is God's punishment for homosexuality, much like they previously claimed venereal diseases were divine retribution, until penicillin provided a cure. The suppression of normal sexual energies, whether homosexual or heterosexual, leads to dysfunction within society, especially in cases involving multiple partners. Irresponsibility in addressing this natural drive leads to the spread of disease and perpetuates harm. When examining homosexuality and heterosexuality, it becomes clear that neither one is inherently more moral or perverse than the other. The same behaviors exist across both spectrums, debunking the idea that one group engages in more natural or right behavior. The real issue arises not from the nature of the relationships, but from irresponsible behavior, such as having multiple partners without care or thought. Historically, sexual practices were viewed quite differently than they are today. In ancient Greek culture, for instance, philosophers like Aristotle encouraged practices such as boy love to control the population, and these acts were not seen as perverse but as socially accepted norms. Even within biblical times, certain behaviors existed that we now consider taboo. For example, women are depicted in the Bible using temple objects for sexual practices, and philosophers like Plato openly discuss the physical love between men and boys. In ancient Greece, pedophilia was not only accepted, but state-approved for the elite. This historical backdrop directly influences modern religious teachings, many of which emerge from these ancient cultures. The Catholic Church, too, has had its scandals, where priests have been documented as engaging in sexual relations with boys, which was seen as a lesser sin than relations with women, because it did not threaten the sanctity of marriage or result in illegitimate children. These scandals reveal the long-standing roots of such behaviors within religious institutions. There is a deep disconnect between religion and reality, particularly evident when examining Christianity's celebration of Easter. Historically, Easter was a day dedicated to the worship of fertility and sexuality. Yet today the Church presents it as the holiest of holidays. Easter was originally the celebration of Ishtar, the Assyrian and Babylonian goddess of fertility and sex. Her symbols, like the egg and the bunny, were and still are fertility and sex symbols. After Constantine decided to Christianize the empire, Easter was changed to represent Jesus. This contradiction underscores the deep-rooted hypocrisy and moral confusion present in the history of sexuality and religion. Biblical narratives, such as the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, offer further examples of the flawed literal interpretations of religious texts. Take the narrative of Lot offering his daughters to the men of Sodom, a story that highlights the Bible's often complex and contradictory views on morality. Another striking example comes from Judges 19, where a Levite offers his concubine to a crowd to be raped, and after her death, he mutilates her body. While this story is deeply disturbing when taken literally, it's important to understand that it is, in fact, a metaphysical, mystical, and spiritual allegory meant to convey deeper meanings. These events never literally happen. They are meant to illustrate profound spiritual truths. When such stories are interpreted literally, however, they can lead to harmful or violent behavior, as people confuse symbolic narratives with historical fact. The Bible was never intended to be read as a literal text, but as a collection of metaphysical teachings that guide the soul on its journey. In this story, the Levite represents the mind, the wife symbolizes the lower spirit, and the servant represents the ego. When the spirit is broken or lost, the individual is left with only the ravings of the mind, disconnected from divine wisdom. The 5 days that the Levite waits symbolize the journey through the 5 chakras, representing the rise of spiritual energy. Entering the house of the old man indicates a regression into old familiar ways, a return to outdated mental patterns. The abuse of the spirit by the system signifies the deadening of one's spiritual life. The division of the concubine into 12 pieces represents perfection, as the number 12 symbolizes completeness. Distributing the pieces to Israel signifies the union of spirit and mind, leading to an understanding of the God force within. This story is a deep metaphysical myth with rich spiritual implications. When understood in this way, it offers profound insights into the human condition and the spiritual journey. However, misinterpreting it as literal history leads to violence and misunderstanding as the deeper, mystical meanings are lost. In conclusion, religion has long suppressed healthy conversations about sexuality, often perpetuating the very sexual perversion it condemns. The historical reality of boy love, child abuse, and sexual perversion has been with us for thousands of years, and religious systems have often failed to address or have even condoned these acts. Recognizing the hypocrisy and ignorance that exists in many religious teachings is the first step toward encouraging open discussions about sexuality, which can help prevent the continued perpetuation of harm.